His was the only boat to arrive.
I think maybe it was a cow. I don't know.
There's the thank you letter from Lyndon Johnson.
There was even a monorail at one point to the east of us.
Plus, everybody forgets about pirates.
This is the coolest field trip I have ever been on.
I don't know, but I've been told keep on dancing, won't ever get old.
Hello and welcome to the Long Island History Project, the podcast that brings you stories and interviews with people passionate about Long Island history. You can hear them all at longislandhistoryproject.org. My name is Chris Kretz. I am your host, and our opening music was courtesy of the Homegrown String Band. I'm in the middle of putting together our fall series of episodes. It's a process of finding people doing interesting work, cold calling them, convincing them to come on the air. It's looking good, so we got a great slate coming up. If it all works out, we've got some people coming back. We've got some new voices. It's really an exciting part of the process for me. And just as exciting is hearing from listeners. Hearing about what sparks their own interest, what they've taken their historical research into, what they've uncovered themselves. And today's episode is a case in point. We're going to be hitting the road and taking a tour of the North Shore, a little bit of the South Shore, seeing some sights with a very able guide, today's very special guest.
My name is Edward Lieberman, and I am former mayor of Seacliff in Nassau County, and I have been practicing for 45 years as an attorney. I presently have a criminal defense practice, and I'm a former assistant district attorney in Nassau County from 1978 to 1982.
Which, Edward, is all fascinating in and of itself, but we're talking today because you are also a listener, so thank you for being a listener to the podcast.
I am an avid listener of the Long Island History Project, and it's helped me immensely not only to gain additional insights of the wonderful place that we live and we work and raise our families, but it's also assisted me in my other part-time volunteer I don't call it a job, but it's something that I hold dear to my heart, and that's doing historic bus tours for seniors, mostly in assisted living communities. And I volunteer my time to do that. And we journey and venture approximately 3 or 4 different tours throughout mostly the North Shore. We do go down to Jones Beach on the Robert Moses tour, but mostly in Nassau County. And discuss the history of the county itself, Long Island, as well as certain historical episodes, such as Theodore Roosevelt. We visit Sagamore Hill. I do a tour of historic Seacliff, where I live, and I was the former mayor. I have a tour for, as I said, Robert Moses and Jones Beach. And the other tour is the George Washington Spy Trail tour. And of course, throughout my research of reading books and visiting the sites and mapping out the tours themselves, I've utilized the Long Island History Project immensely for research and for gathering, as I said, new insights and new stories about specifically about the historic tours that I do.
We talked briefly before this, but our tagline, in a sense, is people passionate about Long Island history. So it's always great to see that there are other people like me out there.
Yeah. In fact, that's what prompted me to contact you was, at the end of your episodes, you indicate, to contact you if you have any suggestions or anything. So that's why I did reach out to you, Chris, to just let you know that I'm doing these tours. I'm getting a very nice review by the people that participate, and it has a lot to do with the Long Island History Project and your former and prior podcasts.
Well, I wanted to back up a little, and can you tell us a little bit about your background? Are you New York native, Long Island native,
Sure.
City native?
I always open up my tour talking about I was born in Brooklyn. That always gets a good round of applause right off the top. But I lived there for 2 months, and then my family moved to Bayside Hills. And when I was 7, my father made the jump to Nassau County, and I grew up in Lake Success in Great Neck, home of Whitey Ford. I lived around the corner and play some baseball with his son and what have you. And did 4 years of college in a small, very historic town called Marietta, Ohio. David McCullough's book, The Pioneers, is about that locale and history, if you're interested in that. And then came back to Nassau County, went to Hofstra Law School, attended New York University for my master's in law and criminal justice, and then was appointed as assistant district attorney under the former DA Dennis Dillon in 1978. And I was in that office for 4.5 years. I was a senior trial attorney, and I was also a member of the Special Investigations and Official Corruption Bureau, and I was also chief of the very fledgling, as we say, civil rights unit at that time, around 1981, 82.
Yeah, that's a fertile time, and I guess it didn't.
It was. And that's why Mr. Dillon actually put together that unit, and we were at the forefront at that time of promoting legislation throughout New York State, which has now developed into the hate crime laws and statutes. So I'm very proud of that.
No, that's great. And I'm just curious, listening to that resume, in terms of the way your mind works and your interests and how it developed into history. Do you see parallels between the mind of a lawyer, prosecutor, and a historian, or the fact that you're looking for precedents, or I guess how much did history play into that work that you were doing?
Well, I always had the idea of becoming an attorney because my maternal grandfather, who I never met, I was named after him, was a prominent attorney in Brooklyn and served in some governmental functions as well on a volunteer basis. But I was always intrigued by history, specifically American history, Civil War, American Revolution, and I've tried to keep up with that through continuous readings. There was a 4-year stint between 2004 and 2008 that the only thing I read for those 4 years was books on the Founding Fathers. And it's all started with McCullough's John Adams. But I really segued into all the Founding Fathers, Thomas Jefferson especially. And with my background in law and constitutional law and criminal procedure as my main focus, the Constitution, the Bill of Rights, the implementation of laws and the interpretation by Supreme Court with precedent, stare decisis, and everything else just went hand in hand with my ultimate vocation as both a prosecutor and a criminal defense attorney. So it still continues. It's, you can't stop learning. So people introduce me sometimes as a scholar or a historian. That's totally far from the truth. I do admit to being a student of history.
So how did you fall into or get into the tour business there? What was this next step?
Right. So there's two stories there. And I'm glad you asked me because I do think about it. It's been a process. So I always thought perhaps in the back of my mind, one day I would do like a walking tour of Seacliff Avenue because of all the history that's right in front of you, that you could just walk down Seacliff Avenue and go to the park and Memorial Park and see vistas of Hempstead Harbor and Sands Point and New Rochelle and across the water. So there's a lot of history with the stores, the architecture, and what have you. But I never really got around to that. And then while I was mayor, I went down to Charleston for a little vacation, and I took the iconic tours. I did a walking tour and a Surrey ride and what have you. And I'm thinking, this could be done in Seacliff, and I was getting the encouragement from that. But then when I left the mayorship, when I was really thinking about it seriously, there was too much involved. There was insurance, there was who was going to do the planning, who was going to do the marketing and all of that. And I wasn't interested in that part of it. So lo and behold, I became the president of the Gold Coast Business Association. I met some various people who were all coming out of COVID. I met one woman who was the executive director of one of the assisted living homes in Glen Cove, nearby Seacliff. And she asked me if I would do like a little lecture, like you be the judge. And I would give the residents some legal questions and whatever, and we get into a discussion. Well, after I told them about Seacliff, they go, "Oh, can you take us on a tour of Seacliff?" And of course, they have their own nice little bus. So I arranged a tour to Seacliff, and I researched the stops where we were going to go and what have you. And they loved it so much that they said, "Can you do something else? Can you do another tour?" So now I start thinking, like, what's close by? What could we do in 2.5 hours? Where's there a turnaround where they could have lunch, where there are facilities, picnic tables or what have you? And I came up with the Teddy Roosevelt Sagamore Hill tour. We don't go in to the residence. Actually, that's our turnaround there. But all through the trip, I'm taking them through Oyster Bay itself and trying to hit all the TR statues and the train station in Oyster Bay and the gazebo where he spoke. And then we go up to Young's cemetery, and we stay on the bus. But I explained to him where the grave sites are and the 26 steps and what that represents, him being the 26th president. And then we go up to Sagamore, and all the way I'm talking about the life and times of Theodore Roosevelt. So to do that, I had a working knowledge of his life, but now I had to get totally in depth. And lucky for me, there's the Long Island History Project. There's Theodore's bookstore by Steve Israel in Oyster Bay that has a whole library of TR books. And listening to different podcasts from history, his autobiographies on a podcast. And so I became able to talk about his life in detail in a chronological order. At the same time, on the bus tour, showing the residents places where he lived, places where he was buried, place where he arrived in the train, place where he spoke to the residents of Oyster Bay, and different statues and schools that are named after him all along the tour. And then the other one that I did, I mentioned the George Washington Culper Spy Trail. Again, utilizing podcasts. Long Island History Project has multiple podcasts on the Culper Spy Trail and the spy letters, and Morton Pennypacker and all the great individuals and personalities. And then on that tour, we go back to Oyster Bay because Oyster Bay is such a history laden hamlet. It's just so many things there. There's Raynham Hall, where of course Robert Townsend lived, and his sister Sally, and where Simcoe took quarter, and John Andre visited. And then I was determined, after I had read, to find Robert Townsend's grave and Sally's and certain other members of the family and some other families of historic Oyster Bay. And it took me 2 tries to actually find the grave site, which is hidden behind a wooden path behind homes. And I take whoever can come off the bus, and we take a side walking trip to the cemetery, which is maintained by the town of Oyster Bay, but totally hidden from public view. So I tell the story about Robert Townsend. I tell the story of the people as we're traveling on the bus, about the historic Northern Boulevard, 125A, which was really, a horse-drawn dirt path, which was part of the Spy Trail. And I point out the signs that New York State put up along the Spy Trail. We go as far as Northport, actually, and we have lunch, and we turn around at the Northport Park by the marina. So it gives the seniors an opportunity to get out, to see. A lot of them don't come from this area, so them to see this.
Ah, that's interesting. Okay.
Yeah, and a lot of them who do know the area never, pulled it together as far as putting into a comprehensive bus tour, 2.5 hours of all the history and all the sites that are here.
Yeah, and the logistics of it intrigue me. So when you started this, did you look at the map first and then sort of reverse engineer from where you could drive as to what you would talk about when, or how did you put it together?
Right. So putting it together by constantly driving around very familiar with all the roads and what have you, and some of the sites. So then, I would focus on, like, it's the Sagamore Hill one. Okay, how are we going to get there? So most of our trips emanate from the Glen Cove, Roslyn, Seacliff area. So what I do is I go down, in Glen Cove, some historic roads, and if one road is has been in a movie, I'll talk about the movie. Then we'll pull into Glen Cove Mansion, which is basically a catering hall, but it was one of the homes of one of the big industrialists in Glen Cove in the 1880s during the industrial time period, and each of his 5 sons built a mansion. One of them is the Russian embassy on Desor Lane, and the other one is the Holocaust Museum. One is a nursing home, and one is the Glen Cove Mansion, the catering hall. So we pull in there, and I show the people the architecture, and I say to them, close your eyes now, take a mental picture of this beautiful Georgian red brick federal mansion design. Okay. And I said, now take a picture of this and keep this in mind when we go to Sagamore Hill. And what I do is then I say, yes, this is the home of industrialists. These were the robber barons, if you will, and the classic clash between Theodore Roosevelt and his policies and the progressive movement against this class, so to speak, and the trust busting, if you will. And then we get to Sagamore Hill and we see a Queen Anne Victorian wood structure that's inviting, with rocking chairs outside and a beautiful porch, and where he gave speeches from, and I say the architecture speaks for the person. So I try to bring in the art and the architecture of the area that we have here and tie it into the discussion we're having about politics, personalities, and policy.
How have people reacted? What do you find they react to? Are they?
Well, I haven't been fired yet, so that's a good thing. but no, so it's like, they're very, the bus tours, I think they're very excited about. Like I said, it gets, it's another bus trip. It's like a field trip you had when you're in school,
Yeah.
And they're very intrigued by the history. I tell the stories, and I'm sure or anyone on Theodore Roosevelt, he had such an interesting life. I mean, any aspect of his life, there are volumes about, just one aspect. So you put it all together in a chronological order, and then you juxtapose his fifth cousin, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, and throw that in the mix, and their careers, how they occasionally mirrored each other, and how they were related, and through marriage, and Eleanor being not only FDR's wife, but Theodore Roosevelt's niece, then promoting FDR's career, obviously. So I tell how all these stories connected, Teddy Roosevelt's, and he hated to be called Teddy, by the way, but everybody does. His children, and their deaths and the circumstances of their deaths, and the tragedy that befell Teddy Roosevelt when his youngest Quentin died in World War I, just a few months before not only the armistice, but a few months before Theodore finally passed away at the age of 60. So in that 60 years, he really put together a lot. And like one of the tours that I do is the Robert Moses Jones Beach tour. So of course you have to read The Power Broker, which I did years ago. But again, more Long Island History Project podcasts on Robert Moses, Jones Beach, and what have you. And then we go on the tour. We actually take the parkways, and I talk about everyone's favorite subject about Robert Moses and the low bridges. And I try to not only refute the claim that he was a racist per se, and I don't get into that, but I do explain that those low bridges were also, or had been previously utilized on the Taconic Parkway. And buses were never prohibited from going to Jones Beach. There was a buses parking area. Buses could get to the Jones Beach by other routes. There was advertising in New York newspapers for buses to go to Jones Beach. So it was anything prohibited, but he was doing what they had done previously before him on such roads as the Taconic Parkway. And he was just following that, what I believe, process, not to have commercial traffic, including buses, on any of the parkways leading to the beaches or other parks. That was just part of the allure, I think, of his making the parkways commercial free. He would have picnic tables on the side of the Southern State Parkway on your way to Jones Beach. And it was really, he was advancing the use of automobiles, although he never drove himself. But in his mind, he was always promoting automobiles, and even so, more so after the 1939 World Fair, which he organized and put together, as well as the 64 World Fair. But in the 39 World Fair, he was mesmerized by the General Motors display of a futuristic city where the cars would be on these supersonic highways above the city and what have you, and how he tried to utilize that in Lower Manhattan, which was not permitted. So, I go through that, and as we're on the roadway, I show how the road on the northern state around Westbury, Old Westbury, goes south and then goes east for a while. And what it does, it circumvents around the Old Westbury estates, which Robert Moses, bowed to, so to speak. But if it was just a regular farmer or something like that, he plowed right.
You go right through, yeah. Well, it is. I mean, it is great that the roads tell a story like that. And I would imagine with the Jones Beach Robert Moses, that would definitely be in the living memory of some of your tour attendees. Do they ever say? Do they ever add anything to what you're telling, or you ever learn from them what they know?
Right. So it's a give and take a little bit. I have my little microphone so everyone can hear me, and you can hear them like talk. Oh, I remember this. Oh, I remember that. Or I'll start a new subject, on the person, and they'll, whatever it might be, and they'll always chirp in, so to speak, and discuss that. And I encourage that because they're telling me things that I'm not going to find, in a resource.
Right.
Firsthand information. Oh, I remember this was used as something, and or they visited places that I'm talking about. So I learned from them. Hopefully, they learned from me, and everybody has a good time.
What's another part of Long Island history that you're looking to dive into deeper or learn more about? Any other story that you're pulling on another thread?
I did have a small tour. It's, a lot of these tours are seasonal, especially if you go down to Jones Beach. So I got to wait till the season's over. There's another one coming from Great Neck. I knew there was a lot of history there. And even if you just see some of the homes and what have you, take people on roads that they wouldn't necessarily have gone through. But I do a historic Roslyn and Great Neck tour. So again, that's really being more developed. We have William Cullen Bryant's home right here, Cedarmere, right in Roslyn Harbor. So that's always a jumping off spot, and and then I segue into his role with Lincoln and his rise to prominence in the East, and I go then talk about, even if we cross over the Roslyn Viaduct, there's a lot of history there. With Thomas Dewey, after he lost the national election, being there to open up the viaduct. So I go into a lot of different history parts, and in Great Neck, again, some scenic, beautiful sites that we explore. And I also go past, and we stop at S. Scott Fitzgerald's house in Great Neck, where he wrote the beginnings of the Great Gatsby.
Do you get a sense that the current owners are aware? Do you think like a lot of people pull past that house and point?
Yeah, that's funny because I think I'm the only bus tour that stops by these places. You would never know that it was at Scott Fitzgerald's house if you didn't know the address. Let's put it that way.
Well, just a stray thought, but what's your go-to if you hit traffic? How do you factor that in?
In the bus tour?
Yeah.
What's my go-to when we hit traffic?
Like if you're delayed, like so you have a you have it planned out, and then you hit some traffic.
The only story that I had, we really don't. We're going on the Jones Beach one could potentially have, but I've only done that like 3 times, and we never had a problem.
Mm-hmm.
We don't go during rush hour, obviously, but when we were going to Sagamore Hill, I would take them through Bayville. So we're really on very small local county roads for the most part, or village roads. But the Bayville Bridge, I don't know if you know anything about the Bayville Bridge. So I talk about the Bayville Bridge on the tour to Sagamore Hill. We go through Bayville and we take the bridge. The bridge had been originally around since after the Civil War, and it's really the main method of getting to Oyster Bay without going around Mill Neck or even more village type smaller roads, and just out of the way to get right to the hamlet of Oyster Bay. But that bridge has had a real distinct history. So after the Civil War, around the 1880s, it was made of wood, and all the farmers around this area of the North Shore, because asparagus was a big product, and they would bring their goods, the train station and what have you, to Oyster Bay. It was a big market. And finally, the bridge collapsed, and the farmer, by his name of Mr. West, he survived, and some of the asparagus survived, but I don't think the wagon did, or the bridge definitely didn't survive. And they've had like 5 different bridges since then. And the main bridge in the Bayville Bridge was wiped out by Superstorm Sandy. So that's a number of years ago. And to this day, it's a county project. They're still doing construction, maintenance, repairs on the Bayville Bridge. I never know when it's going to be out.
Oh, okay.
So there were times when it was blocked, and I had to reroute, or if I got advance word that it was out, I would have to search another route, and even more hidden roads, if you will, to get to where we had to go. But at the same time, you're exploring, and you're seeing magnificent, not only homes and architecture, but just again the beauty of the North Shore and its bucolic vistas, the water and all of that.
And I think there's something karmic. I think didn't Moses have a proposal to build a Bayville to Rye Bridge, or there was a plan floated for another crossing?
So Robin Moses, back in the early 60s, and I was a kid, I remember this, wanted to build a bridge from Oyster Bay to Rye, and so anyone could avoid the city or the Throgsneck or the Whitestone bridges, and you would get directly to Connecticut, or if you were going to Boston or what have you, or the Northeast, you'd save all that time. And of course, there was a major uproar. And in fact, the Seaford Oyster Bay Expressway, which abruptly ends right past Jericho Turnpike on the north side, was originally going to be extended to this bridge. And there was such an uproar, and there were some prominent politicians against it. And Governor Rockefeller finally relented, and it wasn't built. And that's why you have the Seaford Oyster Bay Expressway just comes to a dead end in the original spot where they stopped. Governor Cuomo, and this was when I was mayor, floated the idea of having either a bridge or a tunnel. And at one point, I was the president of the Nassau County Village Officials Association. And of course, all of the North Shore mayors got together, held a press conference, and voiced our opposition to this quite strenuously. And we were fortunate enough that the governor withdrew that proposal immediately thereafter. So, Robin Moses has a big influence on Long Island. That's where he started out with his projects. Jones Beach was one of his earliest projects. think it opened up in 1929. So as a young man, he was very familiar with the South Shore. He was a swimmer, he was a boater, and he discovered all these marshes and beaches and had, as you know, Jones Beach built up with sand
Right.
and different grasses. He designed the bathhouses, the needle, the water tower. When I used to visit Jones Beach, I tell the people on the tour, I said, when I was a kid, my parents told me that the water tower was a prison, and if I didn't behave, I'd be up on top in the jail setting. So I always behaved when I was at Jones Beach. But so I talk about the architecture, the Art Deco architecture, the type of materials he used. He like spare any expense whatsoever. And if it wasn't for him, we wouldn't have the great recreational facilities that we have on Long Island, which makes what I think Long Island. I've traveled extensively around the world and the United States. Still, to me, Long Island is one of the most beautiful places in the world for what we have from an environmental point of view, from our quaint little villages, from our history. And it's something that I just don't see myself like just moving away from. I find myself intrigued by this area, and it keeps my interest.
And I want to thank Edward again. We were talking over Zoom. It's great to hear that he's been able to turn his passion into a new pursuit, headlining these tours. I wish him luck developing new routes. And like Edward, if you have something you'd like to share, something you've discovered yourself or an interesting story you've been involved in, your own piece of Long Island history, why don't you drop us a line? You can reach me at longislandhistoryproject@gmail.com. There's a lot to be discovered out there, and it's really a thrill to be able to help pass these things along. You can find links to related resources on today's episode in our show notes. That's at longislandhistoryproject.org. Our outro music was Capering by the Blue Dot Sessions, used under an Attribution 4.0 international license. And that will wrap up this episode. So, as always, thank you for listening.